Foreigners have always played an important role in Korean history in general and in Goryeo history specifically. So what I would like to introduce now is one of the foreigners who has had an extremely formative influence on the Goryeo dynasty, on the Goryeo state, and the way it shaped its power structures and its education. The person in question is Hwangji. I'll talk about him. He is, I'll introduce him later, but he came from the later Zhou dynasty in what later would become part of the Song state. I'll talk about the notion of sinification, and I'll talk about state examinations. Three very interconnected and very crucial aspects of the Goryeo state, and not just of the Goryeo state, but the state examinations remained important until the 19th century, the late 19th century, also in Joseon. As you can see here, this is a picture from perhaps Joseon's most famous painter, Kim Hong-do, and this is what these examinations looked like. Perhaps also in the Goryeo period. We don't know because there are no pictures, there are no paintings on this topic from the Goryeo period, unfortunately. Let's begin with Hwangji. Who was he? And he wasn't the only one. Later, other Chinese intellectuals, Chinese scholars or officials would follow him in other centuries in the Goryeo period. But let's first discuss him. He was a successful and a high official in the later Zhou dynasty, one of the 10 kingdoms and 5 dynasties of the 10 states and 5 dynasties of of Chinese history, the later Zhou. And he arrived in Goryeo as an envoy. So he was not supposed to stay in Goryeo, but he fell ill. So he couldn't travel back when he was supposed to return to later Zhou. He stayed in Goryeo, he stayed recuperating, and then he ended up staying. And he became, I don't think this is an exaggeration, the darling of Goryeo king, Goryeo ruler, I should say, Gwangjong. And this is a very important point because one of the reasons why Gwangjong is still a very familiar name in Goryeo history is the fact that he is infamous for his purges. Under his rule, many of the meritorious subjects, the people who helped the founder of the dynasty, Taejo Wangon in the early 10th century, founded the country, and many of the people, high officials, were killed in purges. And there's a reason to perhaps also blame Hwangji for that. He never suffered the same fate because he was Gwangjong's darling or one of his most trusted advisors. And the fact that he came from the later Zhou, the fact that he came from a Chinese or Sinitic, and I'll explain the difference in a minute, context is very important. The contemporary or almost contemporary commentaries and evaluations of Hwangji are also slightly ambiguous. And this is what Lee Jae-hyun, one of the great intellectuals of the late Goryeo period, wrote about Hwangji. That yes, he may have been very important in helping Goryeo civilize, if that is the word. This is a term I'd like to problematize later on, but let's take it at face value for the moment. He is the person who implemented the civil service or the state examinations, which helped the state in selecting what kind of people, what kind of literati they found good enough to rule the country, to fulfill the highest offices in the country. At the same time, he never managed to restrain Gwangjong from his purges and from the killing of so many people that at a certain moment only 40 meritorious subjects were left. More than half of them had been killed. Now, what is it that Hwangji is so famous for? Why did he play, how did he play, or what kind of role did he, crucial role did he play in the establishment of what may be termed the backbone of the Goryeo state, to a certain extent? Well, it's this. He brought with him a deep knowledge and also personal experience as a scholar official in the later Zhou state of the state examinations. He had been involved with them and with their reform, which is important to mention, in the later Zhou. The later Zhou state was to a certain extent perhaps comparable to Kodio, because there also one had a ruler who felt that he was being restrained by the influence, an influence that was too large for the king at least, of other groups, of other factions, of the aristocrats. Xuangji was one of the persons who helped his emperor, the later Zhou emperor, to establish and to, well, perhaps not fully establish, but at least to execute the state examinations in such a way that instead of having only aristocrats or mostly aristocrats fulfill the most important positions in the state, instead of doing that, you would choose the most deserving, the most talented scholars, young scholars of the country, by having them take the state examinations. And those who came out on top would be offered positions in the state. That's basically the whole idea. It's a very simple idea. It's an idea that still lives today in other states. The Chinese system has been extremely influential, not just in China or in Kodio or in Japan or in Vietnam. All countries who in pre-modern times adopted the state examinations as the main tool to select state personnel, at least high-ranking state personnel. But even in the 1920s, the United States and Europe also took over this idea that through examinations you might be able to establish a meritocracy. So you hire the people who deserve it most on account of their talents, on account of the amount of work they put in, and not on account of their birth. So this is very different from having an aristocracy. And until now, in the middle to the late 10th century, Kodio was basically an aristocracy, with the king on top, but the king whose power, whose authority, and whose influence was very much restrained by all the aristocrats that were surrounding him. They were, in fact, if they would unite, the king was, well, perhaps powerless. And this is something that King Kwangjong wanted to change. And he also noticed, or he probably realized quite early on, that this was not something he could change from within. He needed outside help, he needed outside influence, and he needed something which was extremely prestigious. And that's where Xuangji came in. So when Xuangji accidentally, or at least coincidentally, visited Kodio as an envoy, apparently made a good impression on the Kodio court and the Kodio ruler. He fell ill, they took care of him, and he basically was given an offer that he couldn't or didn't want to refuse, and he stayed. The role he was going to play was to establish the state examinations Chinese style, Sinitic style in Kodio. I mentioned before that I would explain to you the difference between Chinese and Sinitic. As an adjective, it's this. If I use the word Chinese, generally I refer to contemporary Chinese political or cultural units. If I use the word Sinitic, I am referring to a much broader world of Sinitic cultural achievements, not tied to one state, not tied to one period, but a very broad East Asian world really, or of books, of notions, of ideas, of thinkers, of laws, of whatever you can think of. That's Sinitic. So it's not tied to a particular Chinese state. Chinese, on the other hand, is tied to particular Chinese states. So I'd like to take those two apart. So I'm talking about the Sinitic style of state examinations here. They had been introduced in Xilla before, but never been really used. Now, the most important reason for Kodio, for Kwangjong to adopt the state examinations, well, they were twofold. The first reason is the reason why any state would want state examinations, because this gives you a reliable instrument to select the brightest talent, the people who you want to have as the future administrators of your country. And the second reason, quite clearly, was by choosing these young, bright people, you would choose them based on what they could bring to the table, based on their talents, on how hard they were willing to work, and not based on who their father or who their mother was. So you restrict aristocratic influence. And one of the things you would see in Koryo as a result of this were extreme purges perpetrated by Kwangjong and the people surrounding him to basically speed up the process of turning Koryo into a bureaucracy instead of an aristocracy by killing off most of a large part, more than half of the aristocracy, and also a large part of the high officials who hadn't taken the state examinations. Now, the state examinations, so they played this direct political role, but they also were a symbol of signification, and this is important. Signification is the term that has often been used to describe the ongoing civilizing process in Koryo, or in Japan, or in Vietnam, but it's a very Sinocentric way of looking at things. I think we should probably not use that word too much, but it's out there, so we'll have to do with it. There is definitely a strong Sinitic influence in Koryo, but there's also a strong influence from the north, from the Liao dynasty, from the Jin dynasty, from the Manchurian dynasty. So whenever you see this kind of Sinitic, well, Sinification, there's also, the word doesn't exist, but let's make it now, Manchurification. That's a nuance I would like to add here. So there is, on the one hand, a difference between Chinese and Sinitic, and there is also a difference between Sinification and other influences. That's an important background knowledge, because there is a tendency to look at Koryo history and to gauge its level of civilization by comparing it with the level of civilization of the Song dynasty, of the Song state, to see how Chinified, how Sinified it was. I think that's wrong. It's only part of the picture. We should also look to Manchuria, and we definitely should also look at Koryo itself, not always compare. There is a political background to this, and that's the so-called Sade concept, or serving the greater, in which it is seen as natural for a state that is not civilized, like Koryo, to look up and to serve the greater, the Song state, or the Tang state, or the Ming state, or the Qing state. It's a very problematic concept, so I'll leave that here, but I would like to mention it. Now, the state examinations system served this dual purpose. On the one hand, it was supposed to bring to turn a meritocratic ideal for a society, to make sure that the best people, the brightest people, have the most responsibility and the most power into practice. And on the other hand, you can see that it was also a tool to clamp down on the aristocracy. And again, the fact that the system came from China, the fact that it was brought from a Sinitic environment, which was seen as extremely prestigious, and the fact that it was brought by a successful foreign Chinese or later Zhou official, were extremely important. If this had been brought by a Koryoan, it would probably not have been accepted in the same way. That's one thing. And the other thing which is also important about the state's examination is this. If you adopt this system, and if you train your young scholars in the same way, or in a way that is comparable to how they were trained in China, or in Japan, or in Vietnam, or later or for example, the Liao dynasty, by having them read, for example, the Chinese classics, by having them compose in classical Chinese. And there were also very specific state exams, military state exams, or state exams for medical state exams, or state exams for divination practices. If this is more or less comparable, you also develop a sustainable way to talk to your neighbors. You are part of the same bigger Sinitic and not Chinese cultural context, which is extremely important for the way you interact in years, in decennia, even in centuries to come. So, if you look at what the state examination did in Koryo, the idea was that the way to the top in Koryo before the state examinations was basically determined by the fact, the fact of where you were born. Who is your father? Who is your mother? What's your family situation like? The way to the top in Koryo after the state examinations had been introduced Well, that was supposed to be no longer to be determined by your family background, by your connections, but only and exclusively by your talents. Now, in practice, we see this not working out. We see, and Kwangjong realized that, so we see as a result the purchase of the aristocracy and of the high officials who had not been through the examinations. So a shortcut to basically the ideal outcome of the introduction of state examinations. And we see something which is not unique to Kodio, but it certainly is peculiar to Kodio, the protected appointments, which means that if your father or your great father, and it depends, sometimes you could even go back further, more generations, had a position above the 5th rank, then you were also given a low rank to start with in the bureaucracy once you came of age, once you wanted to do that, without having to take the state exams. So this basically means that if you have an aristocratic background, there's always a way for you to enter the bureaucracy without having to take the state examinations. Now, what we also see is that the examinations were extremely important and would remain the most prestigious way of reaching the top, but it was not the only way. Because the great families of Kodio, as they are known, the Munbol, would always, to a large extent, dominate Kodio politics, and this would not change. The influence of the state examinations would restrain their influence, it would mitigate their influence, but it would never deny or destroy their influence. So Kodio, there's an ongoing debate whether Kodio is aristocratic or bureaucratic. It was both, and depending on the period, it's more aristocratic or more bureaucratic. But the introduction of the state examinations from abroad by a foreign official, a foreign intellectual, were absolutely crucial in the establishment of a properly working bureaucracy in Kodio. Now, I've come to my conclusion, and that is this, that it's impossible to not look at the importance of Sinitic civilization, the Sinitic cultural complex in the formation of Kodio state, society, culture, literature, what have you. If you overlook it, you're missing an essential part of Kodio. At the same time, and I haven't really gone into it in this lecture, that's something for another time, it is also very important to look to the north, to the Manchurian influences there, because they were there also. Having said that, importance of Sinitic civilization, nobody will deny it. Concretely speaking, the role of Xuangji and other people like him in later centuries as the concrete individual conveyors of culture, of experiences and of practices was absolutely crucial. And the fact that they were foreign, the fact that they were Chinese, was also absolutely crucial. It made it possible for their ideas to be accepted in Kodio. These ideas would not be uncontested. There would certainly be criticism. But if they had not been Chinese, it would have been very much, perhaps impossible in some cases, to accept the kind of new ideas that they would bring. So there was a definite prestige and almost a certain inevitability associated with Sinitic civilization if it were brought to Kodio by people like Xuangji and his and people like him in later centuries. Now the keywords for this lecture, and then I will finish my lecture, are the following. Xuangji, the person, Sanggi in Korean, the person who introduced the state examinations, Kwangjong, the ruler who made it possible, but in doing so killed off half of the aristocracy and of the high officials, the problematic notion of sinification, and the even more problematic notion of Sade, serving the great, the state examinations, Kwago in Korean, the extremely important role, Hwapung, which is basically the Sinitic civilization, the influence of Sinitic civilization, the role of the aristocrats, and this is really a synonym for the aristocrats in Kodio, Munbol, the great families of Kodio. These are, I think, the keywords that I would hope you remember from this lecture.